Well, I think it's important to review that when you talk about translational research, there are really two definitions, or two types of translational research. And a lot of, from what I've seen, has been discussing T1 research, which is the transfer of new understanding of disease mechanisms that's developed or derived from laboratory research and then applying it to patients. Well, T2 research translates the results from clinical studies and tries to get it incorporated into everyday clinical practice and health decision making. And I would tell you that T2 type research is an important adjunct to T1 type research, because you can have a great discovery in the lab and you might even show that it works in people, but if you can't get the practitioners to use it, you're not going to get very far. So this is a different kind of research, but I also think has the potential to have a tremendous amount of impact on a very large scale fairly quickly. The challenges with T2 research are things that aren't very exciting for most scientists. So you're dealing with issues of human behavior and organizational inertia. Why should I change? Infrastructure and resource constraints. So it's actually, and I'm going to show you in my talk a little bit, you know, it's not easy to mobilize the resources to address these kinds of challenges to make changes in everyday practice. And the other big one, and I'm glad Dr. Gordillo is still here, is you're really trying to prove effectiveness with what's really a sort of a messy set of data. It's a moving target. You can't put somebody, it's very difficult to put somebody in a randomized controlled trial for 2 or 3 years, or to really look at data as it happens in real life, like the Yogi Berra, theory and practice. Well, in practice, theory doesn't really work. So I'm going to show you what we're doing to work towards this and work at a T2 level research that will hopefully help impact the way that care is delivered for patients in the wound center. This takes, probably the biggest thing that I've learned, and I've got pilot money from the CCTS, is it takes an incredible broad range of skill sets. You need epidemiology, you need statistics, you need behavioral and social sciences, you need economics, you need informatics, and you need healthcare clinicians to put the problem in context. And literally, I tell people when I'm a translational research scientist, I translate. I translate science to doctors, because that's not the same language. They are not. So it's very translational in a very literal sense. So the problem that I want to talk to you about is diabetic foot ulcers, and the problem that I want to try and improve the way that care is delivered. So as many of you may know, it's a very big problem. It affects 25% of the U.S. population, about 23 million people. Sorry, 25% of the 23 million people with diabetes get a foot ulcer. And a foot ulcer precedes amputation in 80% of diabetic amputations. It's responsible for nearly 20% of the 3 million admissions among patients with diabetes. It's estimated, and this number is probably low, I've seen anywhere from $1.5 to $11 billion for diabetic foot ulcers spent annually by CMS. And I think people don't appreciate how sick patients are that get a foot ulcer and require amputation. So the 5-year survival rate after a major amputation, which is anything more than the foot, so the foot, below the knee, above the knee, the 5-year survival is 30%. And that's if they don't have renal failure. If they have renal failure, the 5-year survival is 14%. So it's worse than many cancers. So it's a very big problem and a high priority health issue for both the Department of Defense, because a lot of veterans have diabetes, and for CMS because of the big costs. So in this talk, I'm going to briefly review the problem, which we did, describe the infrastructure that I've created to try and address this question. I'm going to show you how we're going to use a comparative effectiveness research approach to get some answers, hopefully. I'll preview one very brief preliminary result. And I will tell you that this is an ongoing study. This is preliminary, so I want to frame that appropriately. And then I want to discuss the significance of how I hope this study will help us change the way we practice. So I briefly spoke about the problem. I'm going to show you a little bit about the infrastructure, because frankly, you can't answer these questions without the infrastructure. And as an example, I may have a patient that comes into the hospital and they have a foot ulcer. They may get consulted to be seen by the wound service, which we have electronic documentation tools to capture this information. And then that information gets sent to the information warehouse. Hopefully, once they get discharged, we have 2 wound care centers here at the Ohio State University. These patients will hopefully get referred to those wound centers to be seen for continuity of care purposes to get their management. We have staff stationed at the wound center to recruit patients for clinical trials. Among other things, we have a wound tissue bank, so we can do not only hopefully type 2, but correlate this eventually with some genomic results from our tissue bank. So we're collecting tissue samples and corresponding clinical data. All of that goes to the information warehouse. And then the information warehouse helps us tremendously to make sure that this data is managed in a HIPAA-compliant fashion, and then we can use tools to export this data to the people that help us analyze the data. And we're using tools like REDCap, which is actually tremendous support. That's a CCTS tool, to help get this information out to our data analysts in a de-identified format. And I will tell you, quite frankly, that informatics is really the backbone of making this happen. And just to give you a brief overview of what we use in terms of informatics, the information warehouse is obviously a big part. One of the things that you have to do with comparative effectiveness research is gather data from many different sources. And the information warehouse does that for us already in many ways. They collect the business data, the clinical data, our research data. I mentioned the wound bank that we have. We're not accessing that for this study yet, but we could layer that on later if we wanted to. And then external data. And in this case, we happen to have a corporate partner who manages the wound center, and they have a database, and we have a contract to upload our data from their database regarding the performance of our center into the information warehouse. So one of the things that's critical for grantsmanship, because I know everybody wants to do great things, but you gotta have money, is to frame the problem in a way that's really appealing. And the way that I tried to frame this problem of diabetic foot ulcers was to look at the Institute of Medicine's priority topics for comparative effectiveness research. And one of the top priorities was in the top quartile, so they made a list of 100, and they broke them up by top 25, middle 25, lower 25, and bottom 25. Well, this question that they asked was in the top quartile, and they wanted to know what's the effectiveness of comprehensive care coordination programs, and especially in populations with health disparities. And there's certainly a large population that we serve through the OSU East Wound Center that are minorities and may have access issues. So the problem, the way that we framed it with our comparative effectiveness, was to look at diabetic foot ulcers. The outcome that we wanted to compare was limb salvage. So what does limb salvage mean? It means preventing amputations. So I mentioned previously that 80% of diabetic amputations are preceded by a foot ulcer. We want to see whether we can prevent amputations, if it's more effective to prevent amputations in specialized care centers versus the medical center in general. And the model basically is in the specialized care centers, those physicians who are generally OSU physicians get a 60-hour course. They are monitored for their compliance with an evidence-based clinical care guideline. There's standard documentation, which essentially forces them to be more compliant or makes it easier for them to be more compliant. And they get feedback on their performance on key indicators. The standard of care is sort of the OSU MC cohort, multiple specialists who really don't get, per se, feedback in terms of their performance on key indicators. So this is the way that the model is sort of a schematic. Patient's going to come in. They have diabetic foot ulcers. We're pulling them from the information warehouse. This is a retrospective review, a 3-year period, based on their ICD-9 code specifically for diabetic foot ulcers from the ankle down. And they were either seen in the Comprehensive Wound Center or seen at the OSU Medical Center. We are then collecting some critical pieces of data, specifically to stratify these patients that we think influence outcome. And these are basically data elements that are derived from the evidence-based guidelines that are shown to affect healing outcomes. So we're doing this study in the context of comparative effectiveness because we're specifically studying the different healthcare delivery system strategies and using defined interventions to compare these delivery strategies. We're trying to again, assess an array of health-related outcomes, particularly the amputation rate, as well as I'll show you here in a minute, the cost. And we're using a variety of data sources and methods to compare effectiveness. So the primary objective for this study was to compare the limb salvage rates between patients in each cohort, either the LSUMC, the Comprehensive Wound Center. And the secondary objective was, great, you might have a better outcome, but did it cost more money? So we have to look at the cost comparisons between those two treatment arms. And ideally, we'll have lower amputation rates and lower costs in the wound center, but we'll wait for the statisticians to answer that question. Again, just to review the OSUMC group, so it's sort of the standard of care, multiple specialists. I think the assumption is that the primary care physician is really sort of the gatekeeper and coordinating it. And in the CWC group, there's a single doc and a single nurse case manager that see the patient every visit. They coordinate all the specialty care, all the staff, all the nursing staff, all the physician staff. I need a hyperbaric text. They all go to the same 60-hour course, which is given here at the Blackwell. And for those of you, I see Dr. Griever here, Dr. Gordillo, that is open to any resident for free. The plastic surgery residents attend this course. And this group gets monitored for their compliance with that evidence-based pathway. And they are monitored both within the center and externally. They get feedback on key performance indicators so they know their amputation rate. And they're also given opportunities for continuing education. As I stated previously, we use ICD-9 codes to extract the data from the information warehouse so that we know that they're just diabetic foot ulcers. We collected information on admissions and trips to the operating room and ER visits. And again, they had to have diabetic foot ulcer as their primary diagnosis because we know these patients can come in for lots of other things. And then we collected these other data that are part of evidence-based guidelines that have predictive value for healing outcomes. Probably one of the most important ones is the Wagner grade. And the Wagner grade stratifies ulcer severity. And this, as you can see, there are 5 grades. This allows us to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And that's really a critical endpoint for us. And we had to go through manually and pull all of those out by hand. In the CWC cohort, they're entered electronically, but we had to pull these out manually through the charts in the OSU cohort. So obviously, this requires a large N, and I'll show you a results slide here in a minute. We collected data 3 years retrospectively from January 1st of 07 to December 31st of 09. Like I said, we tracked as much in terms of the resource utilization as we could. It included ER visits, hospital admissions, surgical procedures, advanced therapies, and I think this is an important one because there are some of these that advanced therapies cost more. There is randomized controlled trial evidence to show the benefit of HBO in diabetic foot ulcers, and when you see the data, I'll make an important comment. Cochrane database review done in 2004, meta-analysis showed that for every 4 patients that get hyperbaric oxygen, you prevent 1 amputation. Okay? And in an AHRQ report to CMS, they also endorsed the use of hyperbarics for diabetic foot ulcers. Debridements are another one that have been shown through randomized controlled trial to benefit and improve healing rates in diabetic foot ulcers. So this, again, I will clarify that this is a preliminary assessment. This is not stratified by Wagner, but what I did do is I stratified it by amputation. And again, the government, not all government agencies will stratify it, but they'll stratify it by major and minor amputation. And the reason is that in a major amputation, those morbidities that I mentioned were for major amputation. So it's about a 14 to 20% perioperative major amputation rate, and about a 3% perioperative mortality for a minor amputation. So a minor amputation is any part of the foot, a transmetatarsal, a ray, or a toe. Major is a foot, a below the knee, or above the knee. So if you look at the incidence of amputations, it's clearly significantly higher in the OSUMC cohort compared to the wound center cohort, and no major amputation. One of the things, again, I mentioned HBO, 188 patients with amputations. This is just those patients that got amputated. Only 1 received HBO. In the wound center, the 5 patients that got amputations, they all received HBO. One of the reasons why this is important is that, as I said, some government agencies use the total amputation rate as an overall indicator of foot health for a population in general. And then they also use hospitalizations for amputations as a key indicator for ambulatory care effectiveness in managing diabetic foot ulcers. So CMS will tell you that diabetic foot ulcers, amputations are a preventable outcome of diabetic foot ulcers. So the amputation rate is an indicator of ambulatory effectiveness of ambulatory management of this problem. So, like I said, what's not done here is this is not stratified by severity yet, and I need to do that, but the initial results are pretty interesting. So, what I'm trying to show is how we are taking the steps to create T2 research by using a defined problem and groups from comparisons. I think we have large numbers. We've got this, there's a lot to be said for infrastructure. Informatics, like I said, is really the backbone, and the information warehouse and the REDCap database are both really important. I think one of the biggest things that I'm learning as I'm going through this is the extent of multidisciplinary teamwork. The skill set is so diverse. It really is amazing at how much team building it has to be involved. And again, getting that data out to people to do the analysis is a big challenge. We're using a statistician from the Center for Biostatistics. We're using the information warehouse. We're using biomedical informatics. I think clinicians are key to put the problem into context and help guide the process. We're using health sciences, health services research. I'm collaborating with people in the business school about decision-making processes and the culture and organization, and as well as folks in mathematics to try and hopefully model who's going to proceed to amputation. So in essence, I hope we can change clinical practice by, if our hypothesis holds, increasing utilization of coordinated specialty care services. Hopefully we'll gain some insight in clinical best treatment practices in terms of looking specifically at a subset analysis of the role of debridements and hyperbarics. Hopefully we can also improve limb salvage rates and improve quality of life and quality adjusted life years for patients with diabetic foot ulcers. Like I said, it's a big team. I want to acknowledge all the people that have been helpful so far. Like I said, this is a work in progress, and it takes a lot of people to support the project. So I also want to thank the CCTS for the pilot funds. Thank you.